Night falls differently in the Albemarle Peninsula. The air grows heavy, thick with salt and rain, and the marsh grass folds under its own weight. Out here, where the land dissolves into the sea, the world feels half-made, half water, half memory. A storm had passed hours ago, leaving the wetlands glazed in silver. From a distance, the frogs began again, cautious one by one, as if testing the silence for danger. Then came the sound that did not belong, a thin, ragged cry too sharp for a bird too young for a coyote. Elena Park tightened her grip on the steering wheel. Her truck rolled down the gravel road that split the refuge in two. Headlights swept across puddles, cattails, and finally, a shimmer of russet fur. She braked. A small body crouched beside the culvert ribs, visible beneath a coat soaked dark by the storm. Ears too rounded for a fox muzzle, too slender for a dog. The cry came again, weak, steady pleading. "That's not a coyote," Elena whispered into the radio. "Possible red wolf pup. Lone. South of Route 64, marker 17. The words caught in her throat. There weren't supposed to be red wolf pups out here, not alone. The entire wild population in North Carolina numbered fewer than 30 adults, and every pup born meant the line of extinction bent ever so slightly toward survival. She switched off the engine. The hum of insects filled the void. Elena reached for her field kit, no nets, no tranquilizer, just gloves, a thermal blanket, and the habit of restraint. Protocol was clear: ever handle a red wolf unless directed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Observe. Record. Report. She crouched low, keeping distance. Through the binoculars, she saw the faint outline of a tracking collar, not a standard issue one, but a torn leather strap gnawed through at one side. That meant this pup wasn't catalogued, unmarked, born in the wild. That made her both precious and untouchable. Minutes stretched. Every rustle felt like a verdict. If the pack was near, they'd return for her. If not, the marsh would decide. Elena radioed again, requesting field support possible. Orphan pup. No adult response after 20 minutes. Coordinates uploaded. She waited, her breath fogged in the damp air. Then, from somewhere deep in the reeds came another sound, a faint howl broken halfway. The pup raised her head and answered back. It was not a cry of fear this time, but recognition, the smallest thread of connection reaching across the dark. At that moment, the distance between science and empathy vanished. She was not just a conservation educator collecting data. She was a witness to the last wild pulse of a species that once ruled the South. "Hold on, little one," she said under her breath. "Help's coming." The field team took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of watching the pup sway between sleep and shock, of counting each rise of her flank. Elena wrote every detail in her logbook. Weather 22°C, humidity, 90% wind, northeast, behavior responsive but weak. By the time the truck's orange strobes flashed through the mist, the pup had stopped crying. She just watched amber eyes unblinking. Sound design, radio chatter, plus boots in mud, plus zipper pouch, open, plus soft piano note underneath. Field biologist Noah Carter stepped forward, whispering more to himself than anyone. Another one. She's barely 6 weeks. A sterile towel, a quick check temperature, low pulse irregular, but alive. "Tag her, Ember," Elena said, "because she's what's left of the fire." They drove back along the flooded road tires, throwing silver arcs of water. In the rear compartment, Ember slept inside a padded crate, her heartbeat syncing with the hum of the engine. Elena kept glancing in the mirror, half afraid each breath might be the last. Outside, the marsh rolled by mile after mile of reflection and shadow. The road rose, The rain thinned and a soft red glow began to break along the horizon. Dawn. Somewhere beyond those reeds, other wolves might still be listening. By sunrise, the team reached the containment facility. Temperature stabilized. Vitals stronger. In the official report, the event would be recorded as Routine Field Intervention number 4712. But in the heart of the woman who found her, it was the beginning of something that could not fit inside a form field. She signed the paperwork handed over the data drive and lingered by the door of the isolation pen. Inside, the pup twitched in sleep ears, flicking paws, kicking at dreams. "Welcome back to the world," Elena murmured. In the silence that followed, she could hear what survival really sounded like. Not a roar, not a triumph, just a breath that refused to stop. Morning settled over Raleigh with the sound of footsteps and coffee machines. In a glass-walled building on Jones Street, sunlight spilled across rows of specimen jars and faded field maps. This was the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, and on the third floor, behind a door marked Education Lab. 4A, Elena Park began another day. She wasn't famous. No documentaries, no book deals, just quiet persistence. For 14 years, she'd balanced two lives: teacher, by weekday field biologist, by nightfall. The museum was her anchor, but her heart lived 70 miles east, where the marsh began and the wild still spoke. When she was 8, her father had driven her to the coast to see the last red wolf enclosure at Alligator River. She remembered the hush that fell over the crowd as a male wolf lifted its head and howled a sound so raw it felt older than language. That memory never left her. Even through graduate school, through the endless funding proposals and late-night coding of telemetry data, the echo stayed a reminder that extinction isn't quiet. It hums in the background until someone decides to listen. Her colleagues said she had field eyes, the ability to notice what others missed. An unusual paw print, a drop of mud with too much iron, a silence where there should be birdsong. That attention made her valuable to the Red Wolf Recovery Program, a small team operating under the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Their mission: monitor, tag, and protect one of the rarest carnivores on Earth. The statistics were grim. By 2024, fewer than 30 wild red wolves remained in North Carolina. That spring, biologists documented 43 pups born across 12 litters, with 26 confirmed survivors, a fragile but vital sign that the line had not broken. Those numbers weren't just data points to Elena. They were names, faces, GPS pings on a screen glowing faintly at 2 a.m. Every dot on the map pulsed like a heartbeat, and when one stopped, when a collar went still, she felt it like a bruise. People often asked why she cared so much about a species that most Americans didn't even know existed. She would smile and say, "Because they were ours before we forgot." The red wolf, Canis rufus, once roamed from Texas to Pennsylvania. Sleeker than a gray wolf, larger than a coyote, with fur the color of rust after rain. They shaped the ecosystems of the South, kept deer herds healthy, and taught balance to the land. Then came farms, rifles, and fear. By 1980, the red wolf was declared extinct in the wild. The few survivors were captured for a desperate breeding program. 14 individuals, the last thread of a species. From that thread, a new tapestry began. In 1987, after years of captivity, the first 4 wolves were released back into the Alligator River Refuge. The world watched. The wolves ran. That was before Elena's time, but she grew up on those stories. They taught her that recovery wasn't a miracle. It was maintenance, a daily act of faith. When she first joined the program, she learned an unspoken rule. You do not save wolves. You give them the chance to save themselves. That line guided every decision. When to intervene, when to wait, when to let go. So on that stormy night, when the radio crackled and she heard the cry in the marsh, she knew exactly what those seconds meant. It wasn't a random encounter. It was a continuation of that line, an opportunity to keep faith alive. Back in the lab, she logged the data from the rescue. Pup ID Ember, female, age estimate 6 weeks, condition dehydrated hypothermic. The report would move through the system like all others. Yet for Elena, it marked a crossing point she did not fully understand yet. She sat by the pen that night long after the facility had emptied. Through the mesh, she could see Ember's eyes, amber alert, defiant even in exhaustion. There was a spark in them that felt familiar. Perhaps because both of them were trying to belong to two worlds at once. In the days that followed, the museum buzzed with school groups and field tours. Elena smiled for the children, talked about ecosystems and predator-prey balance, but part of her remained miles away in the quiet wing of the rehab facility. At night, she drove back, checked the monitors, measured feed ratios, not because she was assigned to, because she needed to. It wasn't attachment, she told herself. It was commitment. But commitment has a way of becoming love when no one's looking. The Red Wolf Recovery Program had taught her to count survival in increments, 1 night, 1 week, 1 litter at a time. They never promised permanence, only progress. By summer's end, Ember was strong enough to walk the training enclosure alone. Elena watched from a distance through a one-way screen, noting the way the pup tested her limits, sniffed the wind, learned the edges of freedom. It was working. Some evenings, the team gathered on video calls to compare data. Pup number 4712 had been placed on the official registry under the code RW Ember. No photo shared outside the program. Every image of her was classified as sensitive material to protect her from poachers and public interference. That secrecy always felt bittersweet. To save a species, you had to make it disappear from the world's attention long enough to recover. Late one night, Elena stood on the museum's roof looking east. Beyond the city lights lay hundreds of miles of swamp pines and possibility. Somewhere out there was the line between the human world and the wild. And on that line, a small creature was sleeping, breathing the same air, carrying the same hope. For the first time in years, Elena allowed herself to believe that maybe the sound she'd heard in the marsh wasn't a cry of fear, but a beginning. At first, she was just a number on a chart, RW4712F. A code, a heartbeat, a data point that breathed. But names have power, and Elena had already whispered one on the night of the rescue. Ember. Because what she'd found in that marsh wasn't a flame, it was the promise of one. The rehabilitation center at Alligator River Refuge sat low against the horizon, a rectangle of concrete and pine. It smelled of wet hay, antiseptic, and the faint musk of animals caught between two worlds. Inside pen 3B, the red-furred pup slept beneath a heat lamp, ribs rising like bellows. Each morning began the same way, temperature check fluid, intake note, the alertness scale, and most importantly, silence. No talking near the enclosure. No human scent beyond the gloves. Every action had one goal, keep Ember wild. For the first week, Ember barely moved. She'd eat, sleep, and sometimes stare at the far corner as if waiting for something that never came. Elena logged each tiny improvement tail movement response to sound appetite gain, knowing that in wildlife, rehab, progress lives in millimeters. By day 6, Ember took her first unsteady steps. By day 9, she stood tall enough to sniff the upper grate. And on day 10, she growled a thin, uncertain sound, but hers alone. That's what survival sounds like, Noah Carter had murmured from the monitor room. Elena watched from behind the one-way glass. She couldn't speak to the pup. Regulations forbade bonding. Yet the human heart rarely obeys paperwork. Each breath the wolf took pulled another thread between them, invisible but unbreakable. At night, she replayed the surveillance clips, tiny movements magnified into significance. The way Ember tilted her head at distant thunder, the way her paw pressed briefly against the mesh before retreating. They were gestures of instinct, not affection, and that paradoxically was what comforted Elena most. The pup was remembering who she was meant to be. By midsummer, Ember was strong enough for Stage 2 conditioning. That meant a larger enclosure, live prey tracking simulations, and exposure to the elements. Rain, wind, the scent of pine resin, the education no classroom could give. The staff built feeding tubes that dropped meat from hidden chutes, so no human hand became a source of food. A mounted speaker played recorded howls from the refuge at dusk to awaken memory older than any map. One evening, as twilight pooled through the trees, the speakers carried a lone male's call, low rising, fading. Ember froze, ears pricked. Then for the first time she answered. The sound was small but true, a thread thrown into the vast dark, tying the captive to the wild. In that moment, Elena felt something shift, not in Ember, but in herself. The distance between keeper and kept had changed shape. She wasn't saving an animal. She was safeguarding a language one syllable at a time. Outside, the refuge swelled with summer life. Fireflies mapped constellations above flooded fields. Egrets moved like pale ghosts through the cypress. And somewhere beyond the electric fence, the wild population held on 20-something wolves, scattered, yet connected. Every howl Ember released was an echo meant for them. Weeks turned into months. The pup's coat thickened, her stride lengthened. She learned to stalk shadows, to vanish when doors opened, to trust only silence. Elena documented it all, not as a mother might, but as a witness bound by purpose. Still, there were nights when she caught her own reflection in the glass and wondered who was truly being rehabilitated, the wolf relearning wildness, or the woman relearning faith. The Red Wolf program measured success in releases, not relationships. Each individual was destined for disappearance back into forests and anonymity. That was the paradox of love in conservation. To let go is to win. Ember would soon face evaluation for pre-release training, a process as rigorous as it was heartbreaking. Elena knew the rules: minimal human exposure, no direct touch, no farewell gestures. But knowledge doesn't dull feeling. It sharpens it. On the last evening of conditioning Phase 2, the facility lost power. For a few minutes, total darkness. In that hush, Elena stood by the fence, hearing only breath and rain. Then came the faint rustle of paws on wet soil. Ember moving, alive, unafraid. Lightning flashed, revealing two silhouettes. One human, one wolf, separated by the mesh, yet bathed in the same pale light. For a heartbeat, they looked at each other. Not as captor and captive, not as species divided, but as two survivors of the same fragile world. Then the lights returned, and the moment vanished like smoke. Elena stepped back, reminded of the rule that governed every life she'd ever touched. You keep nothing. You guard the possibility of return. Autumn came to the coast quietly that year. The heat broke first, then the air thinned into something sharper, scented with pine and salt. Out on the refuge, every tree seemed to whisper that change was near. For Ember, it meant the beginning of her final training phase, a world with fewer walls and far more wind. For Elena, it meant learning how to vanish. Stage 3 conditioning was the bridge between captivity and wilderness, 200 acres of controlled freedom. Here the wolves learned what no human could teach: the feel of wet ground beneath their pads, the taste of live scent, the silence that keeps a hunter alive. Elena wasn't allowed inside anymore. Her job had shifted from presence to absence. She monitored remotely, watching pixelated movements on a field feed monitor, each blip a lesson in progress. Every dawn she checked vitals, weight-stable gait, balanced reaction to stimuli, excellent. Every night she wrote field summaries that felt less like reports and more like diary entries of someone trying to remember how to forget. The wild was a patient teacher. It punished curiosity with cold and rewarded caution with life. And Ember, once fragile and unsure, began to move like water through grass. Within 3 weeks, she'd established a feeding rhythm, learned to cache meat under moss, and to avoid electric scent traps designed to mimic danger. Her muscles filled out, coat thickened into copper and cream, the color of rebirth. The team called it behavioral independence. Elena called it distance with meaning. Through the fence's distant cameras, she could see the wolf she'd once held, dying on a table of numbers, now reborn into something untouchable. At first, the absence hurt. Later, it humbled. Biologists believe red wolves learn to hunt through mimicry, observing pack elders copying movement, synchronizing rhythm. But Ember had no pack. So the program introduced auditory training recordings of real howls captured across the refuge, each one layered with the breath of a survivor. The first time Elena played the file, Ember froze mid-step. The second time, she lowered her head and circled the speaker. The third time, she answered a clean, confident howl that echoed back against the cypress. In that sound, the program found proof. Instinct needs only opportunity. For the field team, it was data. For Elena, it was devotion disguised as science. She sat in the monitoring van, headset on, tears quiet, but certain, not sadness, not joy, something larger than both. By late October, the refuge turned gold. Water levels dropped. Mudflats opened to sky. The training grounds were alive with prints, deer, raccoon, bobcat, and among them a new signature, Ember's track beside her own shadow. She was nearly a year old now, big enough to vanish. The staff said she'd be evaluated for release by winter. Elena said nothing. She simply nodded the way people do when they agree with the inevitable. There were setbacks, a cut paw, an infection. A storm that flooded part of the compound, but resilience had become the language they both spoke. Every obstacle taught the same lesson. Survival isn't about strength, it's about adaptation. When Ember limped, Elena adjusted the terrain grid. When rain erased scent trails, she replaced them with natural markers, pine tar, fish oil, wild feathers. Each fix was invisible, done behind the curtain of science, so the wolf would never know she had been helped. That was the art of conservation, to disappear so thoroughly that success looked like magic. There were no speeches, no milestones. Only quiet evidence, a moving dot on a GPS screen that meant she's alive. And sometimes that was enough. In November, the first frost settled on the refuge. The morning air shimmered like breath made visible. Ember trotted through the reeds, her coat glinting against the frost. She stopped once, ears flicking toward the camera, as if sensing the eyes that watched but never approached. Elena lowered her binoculars. "You don't need me anymore," she whispered. The words fogged the glass, then faded like a prayer meant only for the wind. When dusk came, Elena stayed until the light thinned into blue. Across the field, Ember climbed a small rise and paused silhouette against a sky streaked with cranes and cloud. Then she lifted her head and sang. Not the cry of the pup that had once begged for warmth, but the voice of something ancient returning to itself. The lesson of the wild was simple, Elena realized. Freedom is the moment you no longer recognize your rescuer. She smiled through tears and wrote in her logbook, "Ardudoyu Ember." Behavioral independence confirmed. Ready for pre-release evaluation. The page blurred slightly before the ink dried. History isn't written only in books. Sometimes it hides in the silence between heartbeats, in the space where a howl used to be. Every species leaves an echo when it disappears. For the red wolf, that echo stretched across centuries of human noise, rifles, engines, and fences that turned the South from wilderness into property. Elena Park had read the reports 100 times, but on this night she felt them differently. Because in a few weeks, Ember would be gone, and the pages of history she'd studied so long would finally breathe again. Once the red wolf's song rolled from the pine flats of Texas to the tidal marshes of Virginia. They were smaller than gray wolves, redder than coyotes, born of the heat and the humidity built for the tangled geometry of southern forests. Farmers called them thieves. Hunters called them competition. By the 1960s, fear had done what bullets alone could not erase their place in memory. Only a few dozen survived in coastal Louisiana and Texas. In 1973, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service began the most desperate rescue ever attempted capture. The last wild wolves before extinction captured them first. 14 individuals. That was all that remained. From those 14 came every red wolf alive today, a lineage rebuilt strand by strand in enclosures not much larger than rooms. In 1987, 4 wolves were released at Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. The headlines called it a miracle, but scientists called it an experiment with hope. For a while it worked. By the late 1990s, nearly 120 wolves roamed wild across eastern North Carolina, proof that restoration wasn't a dream. Then the world shifted again. Habitat shrank. Laws changed. Coyotes filled the empty spaces, bringing hybrid pups that blurred bloodlines. Poaching returned like an old ghost. One by one, the signals disappeared from the tracking screens. By 2019, the wild population had collapsed to fewer than 20. The Red Wolf Recovery Program stood on the edge of another obituary. And then something unexpected. Elena knew those numbers by heart. Each one was both miracle and reminder that a species rebuilt from 14 souls could vanish again with 14 gunshots. So while the papers celebrated recovery, she prepared for reality. Ember's release was scheduled for December, her health excellent, her instincts razor sharp, her chance of survival a question only the forest could answer. Elena Park believed in data, but she also believed in echoes, the unseen memory that binds generations of wolves to the ground they once ruled. Every howl ever recorded was still traveling outward somewhere, bouncing between ridgelines, across rivers beyond time. She wondered if Ember would hear them, the voices of her ancestors, calling through static and distance, reminding her that disappearance is not the same as death. Sometimes at night, when the facility was still, Elena would sit by the perimeter fence and listen. Beyond the floodlights lay miles of cypress and shadow, the same ground where the 1987 wolves had first run. She thought of the people who had stood there before her, the biologists who believed when belief was dangerous, who risked careers for an animal the world had forgotten. Their footsteps were still in the mud somewhere, their hopes still in the air. And now Ember would carry them forward. That night, the moon broke through a bank of clouds and cast the marsh in silver. For a moment, Elena imagined she could see all those wolves running again, ghosts of the past and blueprints for the future layered one over the other. History doesn't repeat. It resurfaces. And every echo is a second chance for someone to listen. Elena closed her logbook and wrote a single line under the day's entry. If we go quiet, they go quiet with us. She looked once more at Ember sleeping beneath the heat lamp and whispered, "You carry all of them now." Winter arrived early that year. Frost gathered along the refuge fences and the reeds bowed beneath its weight. The air smelled of iron, cold, sharp, certain. For weeks, the team had spoken of one date, December 12th, Ember's release day. Elena wrote it on her calendar, but could never quite bring herself to believe it. Every morning she drove to the facility, as if the schedule might change, as if the world might grant her one more day of waiting. Releases always began before sunrise. Less stress, fewer onlookers, more mystery, the way wild things prefer to return. But this one felt different. Ember had grown into a creature of muscle and silence. Her coat gleamed with copper light, her eyes steady and unreadable. To anyone else, she was another success story. To Elena, she was a question she still didn't know how to answer. "Are you ready?" Noah asked, tightening the collar transmitter. "As ready as she'll ever be," Elena replied. She meant Ember, but perhaps she meant herself. The convoy drove east through a corridor of bare pines. The radio stayed off. Conversation seemed indecent. Every mile carried weight not of distance, but of memory. When they reached the release site, dawn was still a rumor behind the clouds. They unloaded in silence. The marsh waited still and infinite. Protocol dictated a 10-minute acclimation period. They set the crate facing the wind door, still latched sensors blinking. Ember's breath fogged the grating in slow rhythm. Elena stood back at 20 meters clipboard, clutched like a shield. She remembered every stage, the first weak cry, the first howl, the lessons of rain and hunger. And now, the final one letting go. Telemetry, ready. Noah's voice broke the quiet. "Ready," she said. The door opened with a sigh. At first, Ember didn't move. She inhaled once, twice, tasting air older than herself. Then, with one quick bound, she was gone, a rust-colored streak, swallowed by frost and fog. No drum roll, no cinematic chase, just absence immediate and total. Elena felt something unclench inside her chest. Relief, grief, awe, they arrived together and refused to separate. The tracker blinked on the handheld receiver signal, strong direction, north-northwest. She smiled through tears she didn't notice falling. "She's heading toward Alligator River," Noah said softly. "Home," Elena whispered. Every release came with uncertainty. Some wolves vanished for months, others reappeared as data blips hundreds of miles away. A few never sent another signal. But that was the bargain. Freedom has no guarantees. Elena stayed until the sun finally rose, painting the marsh gold. She tried to listen for a second howl, but the wind took every sound and scattered it. In that silence, she realized this was what success felt like: emptiness, that meant something had survived you. Back at the facility, paperwork replaced emotion. Release coordinates, weather conditions, collar frequency, behavioral notes. She filled each box with mechanical precision until the last field observer comments. She hesitated, then wrote only one sentence. Subject displayed appropriate avoidance behavior, released without hesitation. What she meant was, she didn't look back. For days afterward, she checked the telemetry every hour. Each ping a pulse in her own veins. Ember moved north, then west, then vanished into static dead zone, then reappeared. Always moving, always alive. It became a rhythm. Beep, breathe, hope. Sometimes at night, Elena dreamed of that moment in the marsh, the flash of fur, the vanishing point. She'd wake before dawn, half expecting to hear a howl beyond the city glass. None came, but the silence no longer hurt. It hummed. It lived. Weeks passed. The world moved on. Reports came in livestock safe sightings, confirmed howls recorded near old dens. To most, just data. To Elena, proof that the wild still answered when called by faith instead of fear. In her apartment, she kept the release collar's duplicate tag on her desk. Small, metal, unremarkable. but when sunlight struck it, the reflection painted her wall red. Sometimes she'd whisper the name, not out of longing, but gratitude. Ember. Every ending sounds like a goodbye, but this one didn't. It sounded like wind moving through reeds, like breath returning to where it began. Elena closed her field journal and smiled. The wolf she had saved no longer needed saving. The fire had left the cage and found the forest. And somewhere out there beneath the same cold moon, that fire was running free. Time doesn't pass in the wild, it circles. 7 winters came and went since the morning Elena Park opened that crate and watched a streak of red vanish into fog. The marsh reclaimed its silence, and the world moved on. But silence is never empty, it's only waiting. Elena was 42 now, hair streaked with silver, still teaching, still listening. She had left the field for several years, grant deadlines, museum boards, the slow machinery of conservation. But when the agency called in early 2031 for a new field survey, she didn't hesitate. The wolves were expanding again, and someone needed to confirm the data. She signed the forms the same day and drove east. The refuge looked different, and yet the same. New floodgates, new warning signs, same wind, same smell, wet earth and salt. Technology had changed the work drones, bioacoustic monitors, satellite collars that sent whispers into the cloud. But the mission was unchanged, to prove the impossible possible one more time. Elena unpacked her gear receiver laptop thermos. Her hands still remembered the motions, though the gloves fit tighter now. "We've got 3 active females in the northern corridor," a young biologist said. "One of them's collared signal ID RWE1. Elena froze. That prefix E1. It could mean East Zone or Ember. No one else would have used that initial back then. For the first time in years, data felt like heartbeat again. She typed the code, ran the search. Signal age 2, 297 days, roughly 6.3 years active. Collar status replacement unit deployed 2029 offspring program. That meant Ember hadn't just survived. She had bred. She felt laughter rise quiet and unsteady. It wasn't the sound of joy so much as release, like a door opening inside her that had been closed for too long. That night, the survey team camped near the western floodplain. Frost formed on the tents like lace. The air was so still it seemed to listen. At 9:17 p.m., the acoustic sensor registered a howl sequence, 3 long, 2 short, spaced by 8 seconds, distinct to the Alligator River clade. Elena stepped out of the tent, barefoot, hands shaking from cold and recognition. She had heard that voice before, not exactly the same, but close enough to stir every memory she'd buried. The pitch bend at the end, that slight catch of breath, before released the signature of a wolf who once learned to speak to recordings. "It's her," Elena whispered. Ember. There were 3 wolves in the group, 2 juveniles and 1 adult female with collar. The younger ones kept close, mirroring her movements. Mother and offspring alive and free. 7 years ago, Elena had called her Ember because she was what was left of the fire. Now that fire had spread. The next morning, the team tracked the pack to the edge of the cypress grove. The rules were clear. No contact, no closer than 200 meters, no noise. But Elena lingered at the tree line, eyes fixed on movement beyond the mist. Through the binoculars, she saw them emerge, a female with reddish flanks, tail high alert, 2 smaller forms darting at her heels. One of the pups stopped, sniffed the air, and looked straight toward the human shapes in the fog. Elena held her breath. "Don't move," she mouthed to the team. The adult wolf turned, not in alarm, not in fear, but with that same measured curiosity she'd seen through glass years before. A pause, a tilt of the head. Then she led the pups back into the trees. It wasn't reunion. It was recognition without need. Two creatures who had shared a beginning now sharing a world again from opposite ends of freedom. That evening, Elena sat alone by the survey fire. The young biologists laughed near their tents, their voices bright with certainty she no longer needed. She opened her field journal and wrote RWE1, observed with 2 juveniles. Healthy, unafraid. The fire endures. Then she closed the book and listened. The night was alive again. Owls' frogs whined in the grasses, and beneath it all the distant steady pulse of wolves that should have been extinct. 7 years later, she finally understood what the wild had been trying to teach her all along. You don't win against extinction by holding on. You win by letting the wild learn to sing again without you. She looked east where the horizon glowed faintly red and smiled. The embers had become aflame once more. Morning broke like glass across the wetlands, cold, brilliant, and quiet. Mist hovered above the water in silver ribbons. The drone camera whirred softly overhead, tracing warmth where sunlight had not yet reached. Elena watched from a blind half hidden in the reed's gloved hands, steady on her field scope. She'd been waiting since before dawn, breath clouding in the chill heart ticking with each second. The forest stayed silent. Then movement. A shimmer of red fur against the gray. Ember stepped from the fog. She was larger now, scarred by seasons, but unmistakable, the same sloping shoulders, the same deliberate grace. 2 pups trotted behind her, darker coats, unsure of distance. Every few steps, Ember turned, touched noses with one, and moved on. Pack E1, visual confirmation, whispered the technician beside Elena. Mother with 2 juveniles, both healthy. Elena didn't answer. Words felt too human for what she was seeing. The marsh opened before them, mirrors of water and sky stitched together by reeds. Ember paused at the edge of a channel, lifted her nose, and tasted the wind. Somewhere beyond, a chorus answered the deeper calls of other adults, unseen but near. Her ears flicked. She answered back 3 notes, rising and falling, the same cadence she had once learned from a speaker inside a cage. Now it was hers alone. There are sounds that belong to certain places, rain on tin roofs, cicadas in heat. And there are sounds that return places to themselves. This was one of them. For decades, the Carolina night had forgotten the red wolf's voice. Now it carried again, threading through the marsh like a memory forgiven. Elena adjusted the scope. Through the glass, she saw one of the pups venture too close to the water's edge. A heron's startled wings flashing white. Ember moved instantly, not a snarl, not violence, just command. 1 step, 1 low rumble, and the pup retreated. Authority born of survival. Behavioral sequence complete. The technician murmured scribbling notes. Elena kept watching. She wasn't logging data. She was memorizing a miracle. The sunlight climbed higher, revealing more of the pack's world, fresh tracks of deer, trails of muskrat, and the delicate lattice of frost melting into life. Every inch of this refuge now bore proof that coexistence worked. Red wolves kept deer herds, balanced reshaped plant growth, restored the water's rhythm. What science called trophic cascade, Elena called harmony, finding its way home. She remembered the old debates, the lawsuits, the headlines, too few to matter, too wild to protect. But here they were, breathing refutation. Ember raised her head again, nose glinting with sunlight. For a long heartbeat, her gaze swept the horizon, and stopped exactly where Elena stood, hidden. Through 100 meters of reeds and shadow, their eyes met. No fear, no curiosity. Just recognition, the quiet kind that doesn't need a name. 7 years apart, and yet that look said everything the human tongue could not. You kept your promise. I kept mine. Then Ember turned, nudged her pups forward, and vanished into the reeds. Elena lowered the scope, tears catching light. Not sadness release. The same feeling she'd known the morning she let the crate door fall open. Closure that wasn't an ending. She logged the sighting, sealed the report, and whispered into her recorder. Subject E1 observed with 2 offspring, behavioral category. A. Stable. Status, wild, and well. She closed the device, exhaled, and let the silence take over. In the stillness that followed, the marsh returned to its own language, wind-water wings. The wolves were gone, but their presence lingered in everything that moved. Elena smiled. For years she had believed conservation was about saving life from death. Now she understood it was about teaching life how to begin again, even after silence. And as she walked back toward the survey truck, she heard it one last time, a single distant howl carried on the wind, answered by 2 smaller voices. A family. A future. A fire still burning. Night returned to the Albemarle Peninsula like a tide of memory. The air was heavy with rain, the kind that blurs the line between water and sky. From the highway, the refuge stretched black and endless, a living map of everything lost and found. Elena Park sat alone in the field station, the lights dimmed to amber. The monitors glowed softly, each pulse on the screen, a life somewhere out there in the dark. She scrolled through the registry, RWE1, RWE1A, RWE1B, Ember, and offspring. Signal strong, heartbeat steady. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to breathe without counting. She used to think the sound of a heartbeat was proof of life. Now she knew it was only proof of connection. Every blip on that monitor was a conversation between worlds, metal and fur science, an instinct human and wild. Technology had given the wolves a voice, but what they said with it was older than language. Elena leaned back and closed her eyes. Through the thin walls of the station, she could hear the storm-building wind threading through the reeds like an orchestra tuning for a song that had no conductor. Outside, somewhere across the refuge, Ember's pack was moving. The receivers traced their path slow arcs that matched the curve of the river. The pups would be yearlings by now, learning the old ways, how to read scent, how to disappear, how to endure. Elena imagined them trotting through the flooded flats, paws finding the same trails their ancestors once carved when the world was wilder and quieter. She whispered to the dark, "You found your way home." 7 years ago, a tiny pup in a cardboard crate had reminded her that extinction isn't a moment, it's a process of forgetting. Tonight, the howl outside reminded her that memory too is alive. She opened her journal, the same one she'd carried since that storm. Its pages were wrinkled by rain, smudged by mud, but intact. She wrote legacy entry, Red Wolf Program, year 2031. Status recovering population, behavior self-sustaining. Outcome, faith restored. Then she stopped writing because some truths no longer needed ink. Outside, the storm softened. The rain slowed to a whisper, and through it came the sound she had waited for all her life. The howl of a red wolf carried across water. One note, then another, then a third, smaller, higher, a pup joining in. It was music without audience, a song meant only for the earth that listened.